All right. Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled to have you here for this event. I'm Matt Cheney. I'm Director of Interdisciplinary Studies here at Plymouth State University. And this is an event that Interdisciplinary Studies and the Open Learning and Teaching Collaborative here at Plymouth are co-sponsoring with two phenomenal writers and thinkers and teachers, Matt Brim and Danica Savonick. What we're going to do is have a conversation with our guests for a little while, and then we'll open it up to questions from the whole group. But we're just going to sort of have a conversation together as I have a bunch of questions for them, and we'll see where it goes. To start off, just some introductions. So they can correct me if what I pulled off of the internet is wrong. I have not run these by them. But Matt Brim is Professor of Queer Studies in the English Department at the College of Staten Island and an affiliate of faculty in the Women's and Gender Studies MA program at the CUNY Graduate Center, where he is Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies. In addition to his book, Poor Queer Studies, which is what drew my attention to him for today, he is the author of James Baldwin and the Queer Imagination, released in 2014 by the University of Michigan Press, and co-editor of 3 edited collections. He's published in venues including Feminist Theory, the Journal of Homosexuality, the Journal of Modern Literature, the Gay and Lesbian Review, and the Baffler. And he wrote an interactive online study guide for teaching the HIV/AIDS documentary film United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, directed by Jim Hubbard. A fabulous film, which you should all seek out if you don't know it. For 3 years, Dr. Brim and Dr. Cynthia Criss co-edited WSQ, Women's Studies Quarterly, published by the Feminist Press. He is currently an associate editor for the James Baldwin Review and a reader for America Studien, American Studies. Danica Savonick is assistant professor of English at the State University of New York, Cortland, and some of us may know that their provost is our own Anne McClellan. So hi to Anne via Danica. She received her PhD in English and a certificate in American Studies from the CUNY Graduate Center, where she was a Futures Initiative Fellow and a Haystack Scholar. Prior to teaching at SUNY Cortland, Savonick taught in the English department at Queens College, CUNY. Thank you both. I hope I wasn't too inaccurate there. And what brought them to my attention just on a personal level is first, some years ago, I read Matt Brim's book, Poor Queer Studies, which is, I keep telling people, my favorite academic book that I've read in the last 5 or 6 years. Partly, and I was drawn to it first originally because queer studies is one of my disciplines and has been for a long time. And so, I wanted to read about that. But what I soon realized was this book was using queer studies as a kind of case study for so much else and so much about the state of higher education today. And I hope we'll get into some of that. Then recently,
I feel like I should chime in and just say that Matt literally talks about this book on a weekly basis. So that was not hyperbole, literally calls it up all the time. And that's part of why I'm excited to be here. But it sounds like it's just absolutely inspired you.
It totally has. And then this summer I read Open Admissions by Danica, which builds
Same thing.
Yes, I have been something of a broken record around here because, there aren't that many good things left in the world. And when you find one, you should share it. So that's what we're doing today. But we're not really, this isn't about the books because I know most people here haven't read them, but it's about the kind of thinking and learning that we can pull from the sorts of research that Matt and Danica have done and the sorts of thinking that they're doing. So I thought I'd start us out with just a question for you both, and either one can take it, whoever wants to go for the first, is to think about, aside from material differences, which I think we'll get into between, say, rich schools and poor schools, what do you see as distinguishing the types of students, faculty, staff, and discipline at the kinds of schools that we all work at, despite the differences between our 3 schools? What distinguishes the students, faculty, staff, and disciplines at these places that are public, that are often regional, that don't have a lot of material resources? These types of schools that we're talking about, what have you been thinking about in terms of the students, faculty, staff, disciplines? Yeah, start with the easy question.
I don't think I understand the easy question. What is distinguishing? What distinguishes us from each other?
No, from at other places. Whoops, Martha, we're fine. Yes, sorry about that. What distinguishes these kinds of students, faculty, staff, disciplines, whichever one you want to take on, at our kinds of places versus the others, for lack of a better word, the rich schools?
I can start. I can kind of come at it from the angle of maybe thinking about the discipline of English, which is the field that I'm primarily housed in. And it, in this moment, we are kind of rethinking what our English major and our curriculum, what we want it to look like. We're planning this sort of massive overhaul of the paradigm that we've had for, I think, decades now. And in part, as we're thinking about what that overhaul is going to look like, we're considering exactly as Matt was just saying, the students, the experiences, what makes our student population distinct, perhaps from, say, the traditions of Ivy League schools, where the field of English really was developed, and where a lot of the paradigms that we've inherited have been handed down to us from perhaps these more elite institutions, which were, implicitly training their students to go on to become English professors, even if they were doing so by not really talking about professionalism at all. This is kind of, I know, an idea that comes up in Matt's book around queer studies and a reluctance to talk about vocation and professionalization and stuff like that. So I guess at Cortland, we are thinking, like, what can we do that will make the English major a meaningful and rewarding experience for the students who are currently attending our university, rather than the ones decades ago, perhaps at schools like Harvard and Yale, where the curriculum was initially formed and kind of divided into these Eurocentric literary historical categories like Romanticism, Victorian literature. What kind of foundational principles do we want our students to kind of gain from their studies of literature? Do those categories remain relevant, or are there things that we could do that really speak to the unique perspective and standpoint of our students, the kind of knowledge that they bring to our classrooms, what they want out of their education? So we're trying to, kind of rework and reimagine the curriculum in ways that it sounds like you all over at Plymouth State are also perhaps rethinking what the education could look like and how it could serve, the needs and the desires and the ambitions of our particular students, rather than students from long ago or from different class backgrounds who seem to, in a weird way, continue to haunt the classroom through the structure of our curriculum. And I could talk more about any of those things, but yeah, we are a teaching-focused, public, pretty rural, pretty white institution in central New York. So our faculty are really getting together and figuring out, what do we want this to look like for these students, and hopefully involving them in those conversations as well.
Great. And Matt, I think I can clarify too where my rather grandiose question came from, which was some of what you wrote about mothers in queer studies, because one of the things that you said there is a kind of distinguishing feature of our kinds of schools is having to accommodate the fact that students are mothers, amongst other things, that may not be from other places. So I think that's where I was thinking.
Yeah, I think that I thought you used the qualifier other than material conditions, and for me there is no other than material conditions in higher ed. I mean, higher ed is built to distinguish people by the material conditions of their lives. That's what it's there for, right? That is why we have such a stratified academic hierarchy. That's what it reproduces. So the material conditions aren't a sort of bug, but a feature. The disparate material conditions are a feature of the university that's built in. That doesn't mean there aren't similarities, but what do we do with those similarities? A lot of people want to make a lot of hay out of the exceptions of the poor students at rich colleges, for example. They want to say, we have poor students. And so then they think they know what it is to teach poor students. Nobody at a poor school has ever said to me, hey, I have rich students, so now I know what it's like to teach at Harvard. Nobody says that. Nobody says that because we know better, right? But there's this will to be progressive and to think that, you know, we are doing good work that is expansive beyond the social stratification that a school is meant to reestablish. And that's just willful thinking. I mean, it's not bad politics, it's just not reality. The academic hierarchy is incredibly stable, despite a lot of lip service paid to finding, you know, programs and initiatives to move lower class people into rich schools or elite schools. There've just been studies that say that mission has failed, and so the material conditions is baked into to anything we'll talk about today, right? And so I don't want to keep coming back to it, but it's going to be the substrate of everything that we talk about whenever we talk about higher ed. One important distinction, though, is that many faculty across university tiers are trained at the top, right? Because the top schools train a bunch of people. And so you have a lot of people with PhDs, but how faculty hiring works and faculty distribution, almost everybody who gets trained, wherever they get trained, they move down the academic hierarchy if they eventually get a job. Most don't get jobs. But when you get a job, almost exclusively you move down the academic hierarchy. There's really good research on this and data visualization on this that makes this point. A few people get to stay at the top if they're there. Very, very few people move up from the status of their PhD institution to where they finally get a job. It's not that it doesn't happen. It just almost never happens. So what we do know is that faculty are distributed across the university world who've been trained at the top. But what kinds of knowledge do they take with them? And what kind of preparations do they take with them when they have been trained to teach at one kind of place, to teach one kind of student body? And all of a sudden they're faced with, this is my situation, all of a sudden they're faced with students who bring their kids to class. And that is not the situation for which they understood their job as teachers. And certainly it's not how we understood ourselves as researchers. And so when that happens to you, you feel bifurcated as a kind of teacher you don't know how to be, and a researcher you do know how to be, but not alongside that new kind of teacher you're asked to be. And so we don't recognize that kind of the effects and of that faculty distribution in higher ed. And we certainly don't say at the top of the academic hierarchy, hey, we need to train professors better to move down. That would require going to places down the academic hierarchy saying, hey, how do we learn to teach you? Which would mean moving knowledge up. And I like that.
So moving then into the material conditions, I think there's, in one of the books, there's a powerful phrase, which is what are the conditions of possibility amidst this? It's something I've been thinking about because I realized in my own thinking I had not realized. I just kept thinking about, well, why can't we just be a rich school? And so much of what I was thinking of how to fix things here at Plymouth State were, well, we just need to be a rich school. And sadly, we're not going to be. Yes, especially facing our current budget situation. So then I started thinking about what then are the conditions of possibility within the reality that we will not be a rich school. And Danica, your book in particular really struck me here. You make a good point of that conditions at CUNY in the late 60s, early 70s were still a lot better than they are for a lot of us. And so what people were getting paid, how they were getting paid, et cetera, was astonishing to me. But nonetheless, it still wasn't Harvard. And so I wonder what you discovered as you were working through the archives. And if you could give us just a basic overview of the SEEK program, because I haven't done that. So what were the conditions that the writers you write about were entering into? And what sort of possibility did you discover that they discovered there?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yeah, so the SEEK program was one of the nation's first educational opportunity programs. It since became very popular, and almost every public university has one of these kinds of programs that specifically admit students who don't necessarily meet the entrance criteria for the university, but nevertheless have been identified by their advisors and by their teachers as showing academic promise. These are students from disenfranchised, low socioeconomic backgrounds. And with these programs, they're given additional tutoring and preparation. Often they will come to campus. They'll be given free books, and they'll be given additional assistance over the summer to kind of prepare them and get them up to speed so that they can succeed at the university. I know at my university, we have the Educational Opportunity Program, which was itself modeled off of SEEK, and the students have specialized academic advisors that they can go to throughout their time at SUNY Cortland. But when these teachers, were teaching in the SEEK program, some of them, like Adrienne Rich, left their positions teaching students in the MFA program at Columbia University. When they left and when they came to teach in SEEK, there was no guarantee that this program was going to be a success. There were a lot of skeptics who said, like, these students are simply unteachable. But what part of what I find so fascinating about Lorde, Jordan, Bambara, and Rich is their desire to teach in this program. And their kind of everything they learned throughout the experience. And also they're kind of coming to see remedial education and open admissions and higher education policy as part of their broader struggles for social justice, right? So they're remembered today for their feminist and their Black liberatory activism and their queer activism, but they really saw these questions around higher education and the material conditions and who has access to universities and what kind of learning students have access to as tied up in all of those broader struggles for liberation. So when they got to the SEEK program, they would be teaching, it kind of varied. So for Bambara, I think she started teaching 3 sections of writing, but there was lots of contact hours. They were expected to also be meeting with students, doing lots of one-on-one tutoring and counseling and lots of help to help the students gain the writing skills that they would need to succeed in the university. So it was really intense, and it was demanding, and it was exhausting. And when I talk about the program, I never want to romanticize those working conditions because they were hard. But as I talk about in the book, they were paid a lot more than the many, adjuncts today who are teaching our writing courses and are even more exploited and overworked and exhausted. And, these material conditions take physical tolls on people's bodies. But kind of to Matt's point about this also being a moment of opportunity where they could kind of reimagine what higher education looked like, because such a program had never existed before. And so on the one hand, there was a lot of scrutiny, and kind of all eyes were watching them to see whether or not this program would succeed or fail, which could sometimes, I think, be a bit detrimental to the work they were doing. But also sometimes, at least within the English department, they weren't really taken seriously. They were seen as like, oh, they're just these remedial writing instructors. They were kind of sometimes like physically and geographically isolated, and they would teach classes in a SEEK dormitory that was like many blocks away from campus. So they could kind of do things without necessarily like the surveilling eyes of the institution watching them. So, some of the things I talk about is like how Jordan and Bambara, really all of these writers, tried to counter students' perceptions that they were bad at writing, which is something that a lot of them had internalized through their middle school and high school educations. They created assignments and pedagogies that allowed these students to do writing that would benefit their communities, to do writing and research projects where they would be investigating social issues in their local communities, in part because, so these were mainly Black and Puerto Rican students from Harlem and other neighborhoods, and they found that these students really wanted to engage with learning that would make a positive impact on their communities. So they created research assignments, and they started experimenting with like publishing their students' writing, right? So this idea that students weren't just submitting papers and projects to their professors, but they were actually creating things that could make an impact on the communities that they cared about beyond the classroom. So you see them, experimenting with student-centered learning. In one instance, you have Bambara kind of turning the course over to her students and like letting them design it, which I find really fascinating. And yeah, so those are some of the kind of things that emerged during this period. And I could go on for a long time, but I'll stop there for now.
Oh, it's wonderful. And it segues nicely into some of what Matt was saying before about the ways that we train teachers to teach. And, the writers you write about, Danica, sort of had to discover their way. But I wonder about what you have discovered, moving from experiences with the kinds of schools that train us all to then working on Staten Island. How has that affected your pedagogy and your approach to teaching and learning?
Yeah, the thing that was hardest was just figuring out what the job was. Schools are really different, and it's hard to see across schools because most of us are one or two. And so I got to Staten Island, and I'd never heard of the College of Staten Island before I applied for a job there. So it was this question mark on my mind. And Staten Island has a very particular culture. It's really, really Republican and sort of Italian American, and at this point it's Hispanic serving. It wasn't always since I've been there, but it used to be mostly white, and then it's less than 50% white now. But the through line is that the students who are at a CUNY school because that is where life directed them to go. And sometimes that can look like this is the cheapest college that I can find, and I'm in state. And at my college, we're a 2-year and a 4-year school, and so maybe they have never thought about getting a 4-year degree, but they could get a 2-year degree. And of course, I never know who's who because they mixed into my classes, and so there's a lot of. For me, there was just a lot of learning about what the pedagogical situation was. Who are these students in front of me? What are their life experiences? What can they do in class? That's not a skills-based question, but what is possible when we're together? Because I think the classroom is really actually a special space. But that space really does change depending on who's in it. And so figuring out what's possible in the space of the College of Staten Island was really different. I taught for 3 years at Duke before that, and those classrooms were different. My freshman classes were capped at 12. And then before that, I'd been at Indiana University. I see people chuckling at 12. Yeah. and this
I was just more amazed than anything.
Yeah, it's just, it's easier to learn people's names, for example, that counts. It's easier for them to get to class and be on time because they don't have to commute 2 hours from the Bronx. So, just figuring out what made them come to class. Now I ask them the question, how did you get here? And so that I realized that that's actually the question I needed to be asking all along. How did you get here? How did you get to this class today? How did you get to the College of Staten Island? How did you get to college? And realizing that was the question to ask allowed me to become a better teacher of those particular students.
Has that affected then how you think about your disciplines? Because one of the great insights of your book is that of course it does. But we often forget that our disciplines are not these abstract things living out there in the world, but they're done by people who are trained in certain ways and teaching in certain ways. And how did that shape your approach to disciplinary work?
Well, queer studies has been really good about ignoring class. And when it's paid attention to it, it's quickly forgotten that it's paid attention to it. And so it just hasn't had a sustained interest. And, a lot of that is attributed to kind of, we identity politics moved away from Marxism or from a sort of old labor movement kind of inquiry. And I think that's part of it. But also, queer studies got institutionalized very, very quickly. And the places it got institutionalized were at the top of the academic pyramid. It's a really different story for like women's studies, for example, which formed in much more disparate ways. But queer studies started at the top, and that has had real impacts for how queer studies understands itself as being implicated in creating a kind of supposedly classless discipline that certainly is there's no shortage of progressive social vision in queer studies and imagining queer and liberatory futures, but the connections to the material life, and not just material life, but the material conditions of knowledge production were for me to be discovered rather than to be learned from people in the field.
Can I ask a slightly follow-up question? I feel very drawn to that question that you talked about asking students, how did you get here, right? And that's one of my favorite things to ask when I'm teaching Marxist theory, is like to teach, like, where did that iPhone that woke you up, where did it come from? That kind of line of questioning. I hadn't so much been doing it in terms of like, how did you end up at SUNY Cortland, rather than any other place you could be. So I wanted to ask, is that a question that you find yourself continually having to ask and return to and revisit? Or is it the kind of thing where like you can maybe ask it every few years because there's like a generation of students and you kind of get a feel for who they are and then they transition out of the university? Or is it something that's more continually asking them like every semester?
Well, at this point, the question isn't for me, it's for them. So they need to think about why they got there. And some of them need to be able to put that into language. This is actually a very queer question. So if I have a student who commutes 3 hours one way from the Bronx, she has an understanding of why she's at the College of Staten Island. She wanted to go to college and wanted to be as far away from home as possible so that nobody would know her on campus so that she could be lesbian. But she also wanted to stay home and live with her mom, who she had always, taken care of. And so getting this, there's clearly a ton of smarts there in a student who's savvy enough to work out that college home life, right? That is a real intelligence. But the students, until they sort of narrate it by answering the question, how did you get here? They don't understand it as intelligence, And so if you don't ask a question that allows them to narrate their own intelligence, then then they will continue to feel like not only that they're not intelligent, but they won't be able to privilege the tough choices they've made, right? It'll still seem like hiding on campus and sort of being stuck at home and sort of an always compromise. Actually, you don't have to think of that as compromise, right? You could think of that as a really smart life choice that gets the best out of both worlds.
Thank you.
Think of just today in class, I had students, their homework for today was to do what's called an intellectual journey explanation. It can take any form, a comic, a video, audio file, an essay, but what made you who you are? And I gave them a series of questions. And so today I was just asking them how that hit them, what the exercise was like. And one student said he found it really unsettling to think of himself as someone with an intellectual life and someone who is a scholar. Because I said to them, first thing, you're in college, you all are scholars. And he had not ever conceived that as part of his identity, and was really sort of unsettled was the best word for it. And I thought that was a great thing we can sort of provide to our students, and got me thinking back. I think it's the end of Danica's book. You ask, or you say that the writers you write about discovered what they could provide to students who were not at rich schools that students at rich schools would get. And some of us, as having experience with large or prestigious or wealthier places, I keep thinking back now to what can we bring from those places. Matt mentions the Moten and Harvey's The Undercommons. What can we bring out to the folks at our type of schools? And Danica, I wonder if you can expand on that idea, because I think it was a beautiful insight about your writers.
Sorry, could you clarify? So is the question, what can we steal from rich schools?
Yeah, what can we bring? I was trying to be polite.
Sure. Well, I try to steal their writers and their authors and convince them to come to SUNY Cortland and talk about their work with my students. We're really close to Cornell, and Syracuse. So I'm just always trying to bring in those scholars and like very literally steal from the university and convince them to come for very little money to present their research and progress and talk about their work and their writing. So that's like a very literal level of that. Part of what I was thinking about in the book is like, I'm really fascinated by Moten and Hardy's ideas about stealing from the university and the undercommons, but it seems like there needs to be something else, right? It's not just stealing from the university. I think we need to be doing other things too. And in a way, this kind of speaks to something that I was thinking about in terms of like celebrating figuring out what we can do within these material conditions of possibility, what kind of creativity and opportunities, and like how we can reimagine school from the perspective of the poor university, but how to do that like in ways that don't tip over into or inadvertently reinforce neoliberal thinking, which says like, you don't need resources to do your work and your teaching, which is not true. We need all of the things, and our students deserve all of the things that students at other schools have access to, at more elite, prestigious, like more affluent students have access to, right? So this isn't really an answer to your question, but just thinking about like, how do we do this work without tipping over into neoliberalism, right? So it's like a fine line, and I think it often plays out in very concrete terms, like in especially like my daily life, thinking about how much time and energy do I want to invest in like thinking from and creating anew and making the best with what we have, versus how much time and energy to devote to like demanding and advocacy, and like we need more and our students deserve more and we should not settle for less. It's like always this tension that kind of shapes my thinking about these things. Let me think a little bit more about more specifically, what can we bring from the elite university training that we have? Maybe, I don't know if the other Matt wants to chime in.
Actually, I have a question for you, Danica, if you don't mind. So I have thoughts or feelings maybe about this, about the critique of the neoliberal university, because it seems to me to flatten the university world and to make it seem like we're all facing the same neoliberal situation. That's not true. And so I don't spend a lot of time worrying, am I reinforcing a neoliberal academy? I feel like I'm on the pointy end of the stick of the neoliberal academy, and so you can't fight it from there as well. And what, I don't know, like I get that there is neoliberal it does set the terms, but I'm uncomfortable with thinking about the neoliberal university and thinking about that its effects on all of us, are the same. I know you didn't say that, but that we can resist in the same ways, or even that we need to care about resisting in the same ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I get that for sure. I totally agree that the idea of the neoliberal academy, I don't think works very well, exactly for the reasons you said, right? It's homogenizing, it's flattening, it erases the very distinct and different ways that we all experience the material conditions at our universities, and the uneven and disproportionate effects of recent higher education policies across universities. So I guess I was thinking very much like more in terms of the daily conditions of austerity that seem to be like imposed on us within, I'm thinking specifically of my university, and like how to just navigate those conditions on a daily basis, right? Like to provide the best education I can for my students, but also insisting that, like, I don't know, our students deserve the same things that the students at nearby Cornell have, and like, and just figuring out how to make sense of and like what to do with that discrepancy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My concern comes up again because of, I think we're all in the position right now of rooting for Columbia in some way, like that Columbia would do the right thing and that we want to protect free academic freedom at Columbia. And I just can't, like, I'm a little torn because, Columbia could pay its way. And even as in a stopgap way, they could totally pay their way. And they're refusing to. And so I feel like that, the academic freedom, not only has Columbia done all this terrible stuff to its Palestinian protesters, pro-Palestinian protesters, but it's now acting like it can't defend itself. And a bunch of people are worried about Columbia. I mean, Columbia gets $200 million a year in alumni donations, right? And Columbia could jump in and say, you know what, we are going to lead. But one of the lessons I have learned is that if we are looking to elite schools for moral clarity and higher education, we are looking in the wrong place, because that's not the rich schools, maybe like rich people, like to get richer. And that is actually a key objective of those schools. So spending down a dime of that endowment that they don't have to, that they could, is not in their interest, and I don't want to side with that interest. And so I'm a little torn right now about us, the university the academy being in trouble, because I have to defend people who could defend themselves and won't.
Yeah, I really like that. I guess what I was thinking more along the lines of that. Do you know that book Broke? Like the racial consequences of underfunding America's public universities, something like that. I think that was more like the direction that I was thinking, and just the fact that, the defunding of public universities hasn't affected everyone equally, and it's had the most negative effects on working class students and students of color, the exact students, that the writers in the book, my book like fought for. And so I guess I was trying to think about, most of us, you have like, what is it, like 0.001% of the student population attends Ivy League universities. The vast majority attend some other kind of university. And of course, it's like a spectrum, and we all fall at different positions, or maybe it's a matrix and a grid within the academic hierarchies, the academic pyramid. So yeah, those thoughts are not fully fleshed out, but I'd be curious, what everyone thinks about, especially what Matt just said about Columbia, which feels very relevant to me.
Yeah. For us, it's Dartmouth, our closest Ivy, who recently hired as their top lawyer, the former lawyer for the Republican National Committee, who's a good friend of Trump's. So, yeah. Before I open it up to everybody else, there's one other connection I wanted to bring out between the two books and ways of thinking, which is relevant for us here in the Open Collab, which is the idea of openness and open access and what's available to us. So, Matt, you write about this beautifully at the end of Poor Queer Studies, and Danica, you write about it beautifully at the beginning of Open Access, in particularly the way you described the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Free University there. And so I wondered for us, where what does openness and accessibility provide for us at these types of schools? Stumped us again. But I can say for us, I mean, openness has become for us a survival mechanism, because our library about a year ago, Robin's here, our library director, accurately say it, but about a year ago we lost, I think, somewhere around $100,000 just immediately out of our budget which is huge for this library. And if it weren't for having some access to open access sorts of things, we wouldn't be able to provide many resources to our students anymore. We're surviving because of what is available through open access and what few things we can afford any longer. And that changed me as a scholar. I work very hard now to make sure that anything I publish is open access, because I faced the possibility of things I publish being completely unavailable to all of my colleagues and students. And that's a radicalizing moment. And I liked, I don't have it in front of me, but Matt had talked about that as sort of the poor queer, of openness in all of its forms as an element of the poor queer studies movement going forward. And I keep thinking about that now, and I don't know what it looks like, and this is not a well-formulated question. But I wonder, as you think about openness in these issues, what comes to mind?
So the thing that I think is important is to fight against, the high cost of college, and that's what you're talking about, Matt, but also selectivity. And so I think, so my college, because it's both a 2-year and 4-year, we have open admissions, to quote Danica, we have, it's 100% admit. There's no, you just need a GED and you can come to the College of Staten Island. And, so this is the opposite of the elites, but also just of, like there's selective and highly selective schools that turn away a lot of students that the CSI does not turn away. And, what that makes possible is unpredictable, which is great. We admit immigrant students, right? Undocumented students at CUNY. We try not to be, not all of us, not all of the CUNY schools are open admissions, but that the CSI is, and all of the community colleges are. And so you cannot predict what the classroom will produce when you aren't selective about who comes into it. And so I would never have said, I really need 4 58-year-old Italian-American moms in the back of my class. But now I know I do, because of what they add. They keep those students in line for me. I'm a terrible disciplinarian. And if somebody, is on their phone, or they just yell at them, and it's great. It's the least queer thing you've ever seen. And these are all, I only teach queer studies classes, and it's perfect, right? And so who would have guessed that I needed those moms in my class? Who would have known I needed the mother who brings the child? Who would have known that I need this student whose home language is Spanish, but whose parents forbid him to speak Spanish outside the house? And therefore, when we read texts in Spanglish, he will not read the Spanish parts, because he has been forbidden. And so that's a powerful moment in that class, powerful for the other Spanish speaking students in the class, and powerful for the students who aren't familiar, who are monolingual, who only speak English, powerful for them to understand the stakes of language in somebody's life, right? And so there's not an ingredient. It's not like a recipe where you put the right ingredients in and you're going to get the right thing out of a classroom. And that's what selectivity acts like. Like, you can select the right ingredients, put it in a classroom, and out comes the best students. And that is completely antithetical to my experience after teaching at the College of Staten Island.
Great.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that Matt said. I thought that was so fabulous. I think, openness is the dream. That's the goal, is to have that free university system where anyone can wander in and take a class and contribute to that class. And that should be, what we're aiming for and striving for. So what do we do then in the interim when many of us are at these universities that fall a lot short of that dream of open, free, equitable education for all? I was thinking, kind of back to the original point I was making about transforming disciplines and that unpredictability when you replace selectivity, when you get rid of selectivity, you enter in, as Matt was saying, this much more heterogeneous student body. And so, part of what we're trying to do is figure out how to make this a meaningful experience for them. And, as I was saying earlier, like whether or not the categories that we've inherited, that a lot of us were trained in as scholars, are those the categories of literary study that are going to be meaningful for our students. It's things like, if you have a heterogeneous student body, I found that in my 400 level classes, you can't assume prior knowledge of the subject because of the way that our university is structured. We're getting early childhood education majors who maybe took one English class, but because we need to open up our 400 level classes to hit certain enrollment thresholds, we're having a kind of hodgepodge mix of the students, even at that 400 level seminar, which at a different, more selective university, you could assume, they've taken X, Y, and Z classes, they have the foundations of literary study, but it's really prompting us to be creative and imagine ways of making a class like that meaningful for some students who have a basic foundation in close reading and literary analysis, and some students who really don't and are kind of there because it fit their schedule and it fit their curriculum, and for whatever reason they end up in that class. So it demands a lot of creativity on our part, and we're trying to think, what can we do to make that even more effective kind of for these students, given the realities of our school. The other thing I was going to say is, like, I can't let go of the thinking about contemporary education policy and what it means and how it's going to reduce the heterogeneity that Matt just talked about as being so valuable to our classrooms, right? If we're eliminating the Board of Education, if we're cutting services that are going to support students of color, working class students, we're going to have less of that wonderful diversity in our classes. And so, like, I understand that we don't want the flattening of the austerity and the neoliberal university, but it does feel important to consider how things that are going on are going to impact, the students who show up and who are able to be in our classrooms.
Yes, it does feel like some of the forces arrayed against us are determined to reduce that heterogeneity. That is the ultimate goal. Let's open it up to the group. We have a lot of really interesting, smart folks here, both online and in the room. And so I wonder what's going through your heads as we've been talking about this stuff.
I was just thinking on that last note about how, all of the incredible opportunities that both Danica and Matt are talking about when we have classrooms that are more diverse, when we have unexpected kinds of students who we wouldn't, know that we wanted to have there, and then we discover how incredibly powerful that is, and how all of that is pushing up against this culture of elitism and selectivity that is, I think, in the popular view of higher education, what they associate higher education with selectivity and elitism, and how we are already struggling so much with the larger cultural narrative about higher education and their misunderstanding of our purpose. Although I would argue there's a reason why they've misunderstood our purpose, which is that, like, the narrative and story of higher education hasn't been told well for quite a while, and for all kinds of reasons. But I'm just thinking about, like, how do we continue to double down on this and embrace this and perpetuate this idea that the more diverse classroom is actually the better, stronger classroom, when we're operating within this larger structure, academic structure and higher education structure, that is determined to convince everybody that schools that are not selective, schools that don't embrace elitism, aren't as good schools. Their students aren't as smart, their students aren't as qualified. Those schools don't deserve to be funded. Those schools don't deserve to be recognized. It's just like listening to you talk, Matt, about why it is having those 5, Italian American mothers in the back of the classroom. Like, you can talk as a practitioner about the power of what happens in that classroom, but that story isn't what people are hearing about what's happening in our institutions. That's not really a question. That's just a depressing observation. But I'm curious what you think.
I mean, I think what you're pointing to is the need for kind of sociological method for really fine-tuned, detailed description of our work. And because that's what's powerful. I mean, for me, the theory bubbles up from what's happening, right? And so the rather than apply a framework, like diversity is good. Now believe me and make it. Like we I think we all have powerful stories that show it. And so everybody I've talked to, I bet many people Danica has talked to, I don't know if you probably have this experience, and they're like, wow, that is a fascinating story of education that I didn't know about. I didn't know those details. I didn't know those kinds of people. I didn't know that place. And look how powerful that is. And so part of it is finding ways to tell that story in a bigger way. But as you all know, getting a spotlight shown on your work in higher ed, super hard, right? And the spotlights are trained to shine on the stars, right? That's to shine on the places that are used to being lit up. And I think amazing ideas come out of all tiers of the academy, right? I am not anti-elitist because I think their ideas are bad. I think they have a giant stack of receipts to show all of the good work, not only theirs, but all of the work that goes into a project, and the funding really helps. So I'm not against the ideas, but they don't have the ability to tell the same stories that people do across university tiers. And that's just because the very first question you asked, Matt, is because those classrooms are composed differently. And so I think we all can have these powerful stories of what happens in the classroom or in the faculty room, with faculty on our campuses. But how do you get those narratives into a larger media culture that needs to be convinced first that they should be interested in us, right? Or to give us a place from which to tell our story. And that's very tough still.
I would also
go ahead.
Very quickly, just to add to that, thinking about equipping our students to change those narratives, right? To creating spaces within our classrooms. This is something I want to be better about too, about okay, what are the dominant narratives that circulate around college, and familiarizing them with those, and then asking, does that align with your experience? Or even just posing to them, I don't know, imagine living in a world where anyone could go to college and you didn't have to pay for it. And what do you think that would be like? And just, exposing them to these ideas and perspectives that they might not have necessarily considered because they've been so trained to think about this tuition selectivity, elitist model of higher education. And, being mindful that they're going to be the ones who are telling the narratives and voting and writing policy in the future.
Yeah.
I think, our moment right now to me feels so different than a few years ago, meaning, and I don't think I share your opinion that the neoliberal landscape is to me it just feels completely ubiquitous. I understand, different groups are experiencing that in different ways, but the people who aren't torn apart by it are 1%. So I don't even care about them. But one thing I think that's really weird is I guess it used to be that, say, the higher ed, the press would only look at the Ivies, and the rest of education was sort of invisible, and there's always a sense of can we keep up with those real schools that we're trying to pretend that we are, even though we have a 97% acceptance rate, and we're constantly trying to get that down, to 92%. But now, especially under the current administration, the attacks against the sort of elite have led to this kind of populism that I think schools like my own have really leaned into with workforce training and job training. And so I guess what I'm really like interested in and concerned about also at the same time is this sort of flip-flop, because I mean, so first of all, like there is no higher ed press. There's no world in which the MLA is the group with cachet. Like, you know what I mean? I mean, these this is like, we are so weird, you know, those of us who come out of a Ivy League PhD program or whatever. So like now, I guess my question is like, where, I don't know, I'm not explaining this well, but like the 99% of all folks being educated, of all folks doing education, like we're in Plymouth State, we're in CUNY, we're, you know, like we're at these schools, like millions of us, right? And most families, like they have attachments to those places and they know those stories. The higher ed press doesn't tell those stories. I don't know that it matters because no one reads like anything about the higher ed. But right now, these attacks that are coming on, say, you know, Columbia or whatever, that, you know, those schools are totally fucking up in their defenses. There's an interesting way in which the community colleges, like we've really seen this, right? The elevation of the community college through vocational training, in a sense that like, you know, education is horrible unless it's the trades, right? Because like those are real jobs for real people, like real men do electrical engineering. So I guess to me, the part that's really most interesting are the humanities at these poor schools, right? Because otherwise you're sort of leaning in, and you know, all this stuff with the trades, I mean, that's great stuff that I've spent a big chunk of my career trying to lift up, but it's leaning, you know, it's very lockstep with a very scary national conversation right now, I think, about the role of education, which is to basically do corporate training for the market so that the market can get served without having to, you know, spend its own money to serve itself. So I'm really curious about how we lean into the attention that the non-elites are getting without leaning into the kind of, you know, populism that is sort of, you know, destroying critical thinking and learning. But it's a very weird moment now where I don't think most of America thinks Plymouth State and CUNY don't compare to like Brown and Columbia. I think Brown and Columbia are getting shit on nationally. I mean, you know, they good. Like I don't care, but you see what I'm saying? Like the rhetoric is different. It's I don't know what I just said, but that's all I got.
That
Yeah,
takes me
I
to
agree that we're in. No, I agree that it's a weird moment, because the turn away from the elites doesn't necessarily mean a turn toward a kind of populism, which would be educating working class people, right? That would make sense. But I think that's not what populism means right now. And so, you know, and also there has been an elitism, I think, of a lot of the political sphere, that just doesn't respect working class people, you know, and I think that is true. And unfortunately, Democrats act like they do care, and sometimes the policies actually pull through, right? And certainly more Democratic policies pull through, but I think they don't live up to that promise, and so people are jaded, and in some ways it's the community colleges and the poor schools that should be the beneficiaries of this moment, but it's disorienting because it doesn't feel like we are going to be.
Yeah, that's what is in the back of my head. Like this is, you know, this is the moment we've been waiting for, which kind of puts us in a very bizarre allegiance to some horrifying things that are happening, you know, like we're sort of allied with a train wreck for our larger quest, but in small ways. And I think also the more desperate your school is for solvency, the more you lean into the train ride, right? Because you're scraping for whatever funding you can get from your legislature that, you know, for the most part wants to defund you, but you can jump on certain bandwagons by not being Columbia, but instead by, you know, training workers or whatever. So I continue to think that, you know, we always talk about like how can the humanities articulate, right, what it has to offer, but that maybe is one of the angles I'm interested in, is like, what is the role for the humanities in that narrative? And I'm not talking about talking to Trump, but I'm talking to the working class, you know, Trump voter who was disillusioned with what they saw as a sort of elitist democratic, you know, platform, and they were interested in Trump's lifting up of the working class, right? Like, you know, it was a bad, you know, bad decision, but I don't know. Anyway,
It
you guys are
definitely
great.
doesn't feel like that definitely doesn't feel like as people are like rejecting the Ivy Leagues, the place that they're going to go to, you know, that they're going to turn to the poor humanities as the place that's going to save it, right? Like it kind of feels, yeah.
No, they are a little bit turning to the community colleges and
Yeah,
to the
yeah.
job training and to the,
Right,
you know, some of that sort of workforce development.
Yeah.
But I think if we could get at, because we think that stuff is great, but not for the same reason, right?
Yeah.
So if we
Yeah.
could get to why do we want to have more like auto body programs? Like we're you know, we're all in for that stuff, but not for the same reason. And I think that's where the humanities come in sort of, you know, articulating what is it that we mean when we talk about educating, you know, the working class, but not even the working class, just people, right? Like, you know, educating all people.
One of the things that struck me in Danica's book is early on the description of Occupy Wall Street and the Free University of New York, and specifically the description of classes that were there, the types, for everything from very academic stuff to quick pickling. You know, so you have this interesting mix of very applied. You know, we talk a lot about the applied here at Plymouth, and there was very applied, it sounds like there was very applied stuff there alongside very traditionally academic and such. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that mix, Danica, because that gave me at least some hope of thinking of new ways of structuring education in the future.
Yeah, definitely. That was, you know, being part of that, the Free University of New York City, where we hosted pop-up universities throughout the city, really, you know, shaped or reinvigorated my sense of educational possibility and just reminded me of everything that is good and important about learning in community with others. And, you know, one of the classes was like dating in New York City, which, like, if anyone has tried that, of course, we need all the help and the collective wisdom we can get to navigate that kind of landscape. So yeah, I mean, it's complicated, right? Because nobody was paying tuition. Nobody was paying the teachers. If you think more deeply into some of the class politics, right? Like a lot of it was NYU, CUNY professors, grad students who were like receiving these meager stipends, who like moved their regularly scheduled classes or would host classes as part of the pop-up universities. So on the surface, it looks like there was no exchange of money, but of course these are underwritten by, like, you know, what enabled somebody to even like have the leisure time to show up in a park and attend a class, kind of thing. But yeah, you know, bringing people together in these unconventional kind of configurations did seem to kind of shake up our ideas about what a conventional class can be, what it can look like, what an assignment can be. You know, even thinking about what are the temporal, spatial, like coordinates of learning, and the classroom as like this bounded entity versus the classroom being in a park where like somebody might listen in and kind of and show up. So I think, I've probably brought that a little bit into my teaching, and it's given me the courage to maybe teach some courses that I wouldn't normally. But I always have in the back of my mind like the fact that our students are paying tuition, and that just adds a complicating factor to everything. And like, how do we honor? I think Matt's book does a really good job talking about like our students are already workers and they are coming to our classrooms to get a better, more meaningful job. And so like, how can we teach them to apply what they're learning? So I teach courses on African American literature and multicultural literature. How can we teach them to like bring that knowledge with them out into the world? So yeah, I agree that like having these pop-up universities can shake up ideas and maybe inspire you, and ask us, what is it that we want from our university, but always kind of coming back to those material conditions and like thinking about them in like a dialectical relationship.
Other questions, thoughts?
I have one thought.
Yes.
I was thinking, I came in a little late, apologize, I had to teach. I was thinking about the example of Columbia being like financially okay, and the relationship of alumni donations to that university's finances. And I was thinking about how ostensibly, yeah, Columbia can afford to do the right thing, but how would that impact what the alumni want to see the university do?
Yeah, the selectivity is key for the alumni.
Yes, and I think the alumni donations actually control the university more than we think, is my concern. In a way that PSU, I don't know how much of our finance comes from alumni donations, but there's just a different kind of financial relationship when you're public versus when you're being funded by private entities with their own agendas.
I've been in Boston for like the past 9 days conferencing. It's been a lot.
Wow.
And three of them. And so if I'm less than coherent, it's because I got like 2 brain cells to rub together at the moment. But I was talking to somebody who's at Columbia right now about the faculty and the grad student perspective. And their strong belief was that the reason that Columbia is capitulating is because it's what their administration already wants. That they're tailoring the demand, that they're somehow back channel tailoring the demands from the White House to fit the things that they already want because of things like alumni demand and fiduciary responsibility and whatnot, which is terrifying and not at all surprising, I think, if true. In a similarly dark and pessimistic vein, but I feel like that's 20. I mean, that's where we're at, right? It's 2025. I've been trying to stitch together a couple things in some notes, but the third conference that I went to, where I was for Sunday through Tuesday, was the Pre and Early Modern Trans Studies Conference at Boston University. Really fantastic. Also a lot of pessimism, a lot of joy in that room, but also a lot of pessimism. And something that came up repeatedly, and that I've also seen on social media and heard from AFT New Hampshire at like the state level in New Hampshire, are the rhetorical dynamics of the transphobia and the anti-trans policies and laws and whatnot. And in particular, something stuck in my brain that I believe happened at the New Hampshire state level, where somebody was interviewing a politician who was in support of an anti-trans law, and they were like, have you looked at the data? Here's all this data. And he was completely uninterested in the data, but he talked to an activist who had detransitioned and said, here's how this gender ideology fucked up my life. And that one conversation,
That one story
completely changed.
Oh, it's anecdotal.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so, and I too am being anecdotal here, but I'm wondering if we're in a moment where the data doesn't matter because everybody's just like, oh, I can just produce my own data. That what you need is strong storytelling, which great opportunity for the humanities. But some of the examples of the strongest storytelling are from the autocratic elements, or from places that are denying people's rights. And I think one of the scary elements here, and I'm looking back at some of the comments that Liz made and also that Robin made about American bootstrapping, like stories of success in America become stories of individual success.
Mhm.
About some of my research in cognitive science about how like losses psychologically we feel them stronger. Losing $20 feels much more magnified than gaining $20.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which if the rhetorical field right now, or the rhetorical sort of like the realm of political discourse is in the negative, like maybe a disproportionate amount of positive anecdotes would be required to push back on the negative ones.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering is, and the positive ones turn into these stories of bootstrapping. And yeah, I think Liz, you're right. That sense of like stories
Yeah,
just confirming
exactly.
already deeply held
Totally,
beliefs.
yeah. That was the story they wanted to hear.
So what I wonder, and I do not have an answer for this, and I don't know that there is one, but again, I said pessimism. What's the story of loss from a working class perspective, from the perspective of our students at these institutions, that would cut through the noise?
That got people thinking. Liz? You'll have to unmute. Teams is weird.
Sorry, I'm not usually on Teams. I think, your question, like, oh man, I had such a brilliant, pithy response, and in the seconds between looking for and finding the unmute button, my brilliance has been lost. Damn it.
Yep.
Stories. So, like, I think. I know what I was going to say. Like, I think the challenge with stories is connected to the challenge of individualism, right? Because the power of the kind of story we might be talking about is the story of an individual, right? It's personalized, and like, so it kind of reinforces the specialness of individuals, or like I don't know if there's any, I mean, that doesn't negate their like power and beauty, kind of, but also if one of the problems is this notion of, it's your fault, it's your individual fault that you failed, it's your individual merit that you succeeded, then like those stories just are part of that. So yeah, I don't know if anyone else has a better answer. That wasn't really an answer.
I'm
I have
just
lots
really.
No,
This
go
is just
ahead.
taking me back to, I think, something Matt Brim said earlier, which was about helping our students to tell their own stories, right? And I'm wondering if some of this is about refocusing the storytelling a little bit less on broadcasting. What stories do we need to be telling and broadcasting more widely, and more in how do we connect our students to the stories about themselves that they need to be telling themselves, so that as they go out into, quote unquote, the world, not that they don't already live in the world, but yes, as they go out into the world, that's the story they take with them. And one of the things that was really struck me as I was listening to him talk is, as a parent, I remember being told at one point that one of the best things you can do as a parent when your children are, particularly when your children are young, is to tell them stories about who they are, right? Because they absorb that, and if you think about it in the negative, right? Children who suffer great trauma often in their childhood, it's because they have been told bad stories about themselves growing up. So pushing against that by literally telling your children stories, good stories about who they are, is a way that you actually build up their own sort of sense of self-worth and all of those strong qualities that you're trying to help them really connect with. And so some of it is about helping our students learn how to tell their story, and some of it is about telling them the story of who we see, right? Like of who we see them who we see in our classroom.
And one last thing, and I'll shut up, I swear. Martha, you've helped me regain some of the optimism. One of the things that I had down in my notes that I completely blanked on until you just spoke was that like tragedies aren't the only genre that involve loss.
Mm-hmm.
You can tell stories that have the gravity of loss that still end well.
Yeah.
And still have an upswing.
Yeah.
So maybe that's part
And
of
that
the
are still
element too.
inspiring and-
Yeah.
There goes my writing career.
I wanted to say too that just listening to the last few minutes, listening to Martha and thinking more about stories, like I keep coming back to Matt Brim's "How Did You Get Here?" Like that is such a story prompt, and my anecdote there is, we have an activity here they've had for years. One of my colleagues thought it up, and essentially having our new English majors go interview people on and around campus who were English majors and ask them, you know, what was it like, and how did you get here? And really, like, in being asked that over and over again, the students' work helped me later in life than I'd prefer really sort of acknowledge and tell a true story about like the deep privilege embedded in how I got where I am, as a like, and so that invitation to me from those students, which was in a sense a flavor of how did you get here, has been really helpful in making me a better teacher, I think, and a more, I don't know, tell a little more of the truth to myself about myself and others about myself. And so I'm really, that's going to be a big, I hate this word, takeaway for me today, is that question as a prompt, is sort of a way, a story prompt, sort of a rethinking prompt, and like a live prompt, a potentially evolving prompt, or responses but sort of potentially evolving. And so I'm very happy about that. And I just want to say one more thing real quick. Danica, I loved reading your work in the INCAP collective. Like reading that work in draft was so like life-saving in 2022. So I'm so happy to see it out there, and like, yay.
I've been waiting for a good opportunity to chime in to thank you so much for your feedback. I could not have done it without you. That feedback, that INCAP like collective discussion that we had, I think it was like of 2 of the chapters, just like helped me push through and get to where it needed to be. And I think the book is so much better for it. So thank you so much for that really thoughtful and generous feedback.
Forgot
Well
about that
done.
connect. I actually have an InkCap sticker on my computer here because Trina and I both published with Pumpkin Books, so very exciting. I wonder if in our last 10 minutes we can finish up with thinking about where the excitement still exists. I think it's very easy for us, I'll pull off of Nick's urge to find some happiness and such within dark times. It's easy to identify all of the struggles and obstacles, but I wonder where possibility and excitement lies for you both, Matt and Danica. Anybody wants to jump in on that?
So I've got this research project underway called Redistributing Resources in Queer Higher Education, and it's really about asking the question, where are the resources in queer theory? You know, I mean, we know they're kind of at the top, but there are lots of kinds of resources all over the place, and the field hasn't tracked that. And then once we identify them, how can we share them with each other? And that sharing is very multi-directional. And this is exciting to me. So I've had 21 interviews with queer studies faculty all across the spectrum of higher ed schools, including precarious graduate students and people who have left, queer studies scholars who have left the academy. And it's pretty fascinating. People really do have a lot to say about what they have to share, and less about even what they need or want from other places, right? But everybody has a good sense of resources at their particular place. And it can be surprising what we have and what we have to share. And almost everybody has said, oh, hey, so at some point in this interview, oh, right, I've got this other thing. Do you want to collaborate? And so there's this real spirit. Once we ask the question, what have you got and how can we redistribute it? And that word is a little more loaded than sharing, but people see opportunities when just ask that simple question, right? So it's like sort of starting from not from a deficit model, but thinking about what we have, and obviously, I really think that money needs to flow around the university in a different way, right? And so this is not trying to say that those material resources that Danica was talking about earlier that we desperately don't need to come from the top down. They need to come from the top down, right? Absolutely. But the whole idea of knowledge production in different places is that it gives us different kinds of resources to share, from our students to our regional locations, and so I think that we're all in a position of strength once we ask ourselves what we have to share, and that will connect us across my field of queer studies. We don't have a national organization, professional organization. We don't have a kind of built-in structure across which that we can navigate. And so what ends up happening is it looks very insidery, right? Queer studies, queer theory feels very, very insidery. But that's not, I don't individualize that problem. It's just we haven't found ways to share resources with it. My answer is we haven't found ways to share resources with each other. But when you talk to people about that, they're eager to do it. So that I'm excited about that. And figuring out then how to make that happen in a broad-based way, how to regularize it or build in structures for that rather than just make it sort of one-offs, which are great, but finding models that can be replicated or taken up and then forming some kind of a web or network is the bigger work.
Hey, before you turn it over to Danica to say brilliant things and close us out, can I ask one other brilliant person in the room, not to put him on the spot, but in terms of this particular set of topics and questions, I have learned so much from working in the collab with Elliot. And I think if I'm seeing correctly, Elliot is sitting there. And I'm just wondering, I know like as a student, you probably feel like, oh God, don't put me on the spot. But I was wondering if
He's turning red.
I'm sure. I was wondering if there was anything you wanted to chime in, just because I feel like you have a really interesting perspective on this stuff. And is there anything in particular that kind of jumped out to you and you were like, oh, I kind of have an idea about that? No problem if not, but I would value your insight because you always have great stuff about
We
this.
all do.
I guess something that stuck out to me was talking about stories and loss. As a trans student here, I'm also an independent student, so I have had to do a lot of work just to be here and be able to afford being here. I work 3 jobs, but at the same time as there was the initial loss of the first not being able to be a student, I also find a lot of victory and hope of being able to be here. And I don't know, I feel like I think a part of it is how we tell stories, because you could just as equally talk about, well, sorry, language, I almost swore.
Robin already did.
That sucks that he's been homeless, he's had to like camp out in terms of like, I don't like camping, but I've definitely had to do it while waiting for in between leases and trying to get housing because I don't. Yeah. You could talk about that in terms of loss, but you could also talk about that in terms of something that you made it, you know? And there's the whole American individualism idea, but I also find a lot of credit in the wonderful people that I've had around me. I don't know where I would be if I didn't have wonderful people in my life to lean on for strength. And I feel like the individualism stuff kind of shucks away any sense of community. And I feel like there's a lot of value in the community that we find ourselves in. That's, I hope that's.
I knew you'd bring the goods. I knew you'd bring it.
Danica, where do you find excitement and possibility these days?
Yeah, definitely. It's in community. It's in getting to have conversations like this with all of you. It's in the communities that we form in our classrooms with our students, getting to know them and where they came from, and what they want out of the world, and maybe introducing them to perspectives they haven't necessarily considered, or inviting them to think beyond American individualist narratives. One of the courses I'm teaching this semester that I'm excited about, which is kind of an experiment. We are putting together a student journal of literary and cultural criticism, a digital online journal that will publish the writing of students at our college. And this has just been so fun for me to kind of, the entire class is like, students are conceptualizing what they want the journal to look like. They wrote the submission guidelines. They decided what the policies are going to be. They're going to be writing pieces. They're going to be editing and providing feedback on each other's work, and just getting to like make something concrete and tangible that we envision will have like a positive impact and will build intellectual community within our campus has been such a rewarding experience. And there's like a, what's the word? There's a prefigurative politics element to it, which is that like we're making all decisions collectively. We're trying to ensure that all student voices are heard. We're negotiating disagreements and conflicts about, what should the logo for the journal be? And so just kind of working through all those and getting to make those decisions collectively together. And, we already have like a website, and just every step has felt so rewarding and has like reminded me why it is I do what I do, because getting to work with students and bring their vision to life, and to create this thing that it's gonna outlive their time once they graduate. We're still gonna have this journal, but they're gonna decide what they want the future to look like, and we're making decisions about is it going to become a student club, or like what will the managing editor position look like. So really just those kind of concrete daily interactions and experiences, and creating the community that we want to be in together in our classroom through our collaborative work on this journal, making sure work is distributed equitably, all kinds of stuff like that just feels like it gives me joy, and it gives me hope, and it reminds me like, oh, this is why we do what we do.
The logo fight is the deadliest of fights, by the way. No team ever wins when they have to agree on a logo.
I must say the dragon we decided upon is like very cool, but like not scary, but like very confident. It's a great dragon.
All right, well, we are just about at time. I want to thank very much Matt Brim and Danica Savonick for joining us. It was really wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.